It is marvellous tunes like that which make Rossini the best-loved and most successful of all writers of comic opera. And of his comic operas, none is more famous or more frequently performed than The Barber of Seville. Rossini, master of comedy, Rossini, high priest of the age of bel canto, Rossini, the bon viveur whose laziness and fondness for good food were legends in his lifetime, all these light and frivolous images come to mind when the name of Rossini is mentioned. The very fattening Tornado Rossini, a fillet steak with pâté de foie gras melted over it, is named after him. But the truth about Rossini was richer and more complex even than the legends. Rossini's life had more twists and turns, more paradoxes than even the most convoluted of his comic opera plots. For a start, try this paradox. Rossini was born in 1792 and has just celebrated his 52nd birthday. How come? Because he was born in Pesaro on the Adriatic coast on February the 29th, leap year's day, 1792. How the old rogue would have relished the paradox that as his juniors reach their 150th anniversaries and more, he is on the edge of middle age. It's as if he never really grew old, and in a sense he didn't, because his music is as fresh and tuneful, as full of delights and brilliant comic invention as the day he wrote it. Paradox number 2. Though he is best remembered as a composer of comic operas like The Italian Girl in Algiers, Cinderella, La Cenerentola in Italian, The Turk in Italy, The Barber of Seville, and more, of the 40 or more operas he wrote in his career, the vast majority were on serious subjects. Yet until only a few years ago, these serious works were completely ignored, and Rossini was seen as a highly successful comedian of the opera house. We even have the advice of Beethoven on the subject, who allegedly advised Rossini to make more barbers. Paradox number 3 has it that Rossini was lazy. So lazy that a story went the rounds of the morning he was sitting up in bed, surrounded by plump pillows, writing an opera. He composed a tenor aria, put it on the bed beside him, and unfortunately it slipped off and fell to the floor. Rossini was too lazy to get out of bed, so he just wrote another tenor aria. True? Who knows? But the Italians have a wonderful expression, "Se non è vero, è ben trovato," which means that even if it isn't true, it might as well be. Italy, at the beginning of the 19th century, had an amazingly vibrant, exciting, and often chaotic operatic climate, rather like England in the Elizabethan age or the early days of Hollywood. Mad, erratic directors, harassed producers, vain and overfed stars, all producing work under conditions that would kill an ox, yet producing work of astonishing quality and value. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Beaumont and Fletcher, Mack Sennett, Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffiths, Rossini, Donizetti and Bellini would all sympathise with the deadline-driven writer of TV sitcoms. It would certainly never have occurred to Rossini that we would be discussing his opera 200 years after its first performance. So it was that Donizetti, who wrote over 70 operas in a tragically short life, could complete one of his great tragedies in 3 weeks, and Rossini could complete a score of the length and complexity of The Barber of Seville in an amazing 14 days. But the greatest paradox of Rossini was his own life. Amazingly gifted and a prodigy almost on the scale of Mozart, he had his first opera produced in Venice when he was 18. He was director of the immensely prestigious San Carlo Opera in Naples, still Italy's loveliest opera house, at the age of 22. In the next 7 years, he would produce 10 grand, tragic operas for that theatre. He was only 24 when his Barber of Seville received its notoriously disastrous premiere in Rome in 1816. His 40th and final opera was William Tell, best remembered now for its famous Lone Ranger overture. This was written in French as Guillaume Tell for the Paris Opera when the composer was just short of 40. He would go on to live for another nearly 40 years and write no more operas. Why ever not? Well, musicologists have debated that one for 150 years. One cynical explanation was that Rossini had made his name and his fortune as Italy's most successful composer, and, like many another successful businessman, was willing and able to retire at 40 and live a life of ease. Another, maybe more credible reason was that the world was changing more dramatically in the post-Napoleonic era, and faster maybe than in any age up until our own. And Rossini, whose roots were in the late 18th century, simply felt out of place in the age of the Romantics. His social comedies, farces almost, had no place in the deeply serious age of The Sorrows of Young Werther. His great set pieces like Semiramide, his last opera for Italy, may have seemed dated against the realism gradually gaining a foothold in the theatre. Or maybe he was lazy and was simply unwilling to write operas of the massive 5-act duration and musical density required by the audiences of Paris, where he lived. Whatever the reason, Rossini lived in luxurious retirement in Paris for 40 years, putting on weight, holding salons where his biting and cynical wit became legendary, and acting the role of grand seigneur to perfection. Maybe of all the composers who have ever lived, the one with whom you could have spent the best evening of conversation, great food and wine was Rossini. Rossini or Schubert. But we need to go back to the Rome of 1816. It was there that the disastrous premiere took place of an opera which we now regard as among the treasures of the repertoire. Rossini was, as we've said, a mere lad, just short of his 24th, or, if you prefer, his 6th birthday. But he already had 16 operas under his belt. His 17th, The Barber of Seville, received its premiere on February the 20th, 1816, at the Teatro Argentina. This theatre still stands, though it is used nowadays mainly for serious plays. It is on one side of the Lago Sacra Argentina, best known to archaeologists as the site of 4 miraculously preserved Republican-era Roman temples, and best known to tourists as a bus terminal. H.V. Morton, one of the most creative travel writers on Rome, went once in search of the actual site of Julius Caesar's assassination, which he knew, even if Shakespeare didn't, had taken place in the Theatre of Pompey, and not in the Senate House. By tracing the outline of that theatre and working out where the portico had been located in which the dreadful deed was done, Morton found to his delight that it lay beneath the lobby of the Teatro Argentina. It proved that Rome is like an onion with layer upon overlapping layer of history. Peel back the Barber of Seville and you discover the assassination of Julius Caesar. The opera season in those days was dictated by religious considerations. It began usually in December. La Scala Milan to this day opens its season on December the 6th, and the season ran until the beginning of Lent. It ran, in other words, through Carnival up until Mardi Gras, or Fat Tuesday, the last day of binge before Ash Wednesday and the 40 days of fasting leading up to Easter. An opera would be produced in great haste, and the stories a legion of harassed singers being handed their music still wet from the copiers, to be learned and rehearsed in the mornings while they continued to perform the current opera in the evening. If successful, an opera would receive maybe 30 performances in the season. And since the opera house was the social and entertainment centre of people's lives, most would attend the new piece many times before Easter. So it had better be good. A poor piece or a bad performance would be greeted with the derision nowadays reserved for a dropped catch or a fumble. There used to be a belief that the dreadful reception handed down from the gallery on the first night of The Barber of Seville was inspired, if that's the word, by the supporters of a rival composer. Paisiello had a very successful opera called The Barber of Seville in the repertoire. The theory went that Paisiello's supporters, or claque, as it's called in the opera house, resented the upstart Rossini daring to write another opera on the same story. Well, that's probably just nonsense. It was common practice for many composers to set the same exact libretto. Indeed, there are said to be 17 Barbers of Seville floating around, though Rossini's is the only one frequently performed today. Other memoirs tell of a cat crossing the stage during the premiere and receiving the only favourable ovation of the evening, and so on. The most likely explanation is that the cast was tired and didn't know the music well enough to perform it at strength. They probably hadn't learned any of the stage business, as comic routines are called in the theatre, at least not well enough to pull the complex piece off. Whatever the reason, the first night was a famous fiasco, a fate shared with Bizet's Carmen and Puccini's Madame Butterfly. But the second night went just fine, and the rest, as you might say, is theatrical history. And no wonder. Because what makes The Barber of Seville so special is that it has a great story, is very funny, has wonderful tunes and splendid opportunities for vocal fireworks from a small but talented cast. The orchestra's role is often more brilliant and interesting still, and a million miles removed from the chum-chum chum-chum accompaniments of earlier, and many later, operas for that matter. Let's start with what the antique dealers call the provenance of the piece. It is based on a play by Beaumarchais, and here the chronology, at least as far as the opera house is concerned, can get a little complicated. Beaumarchais wrote 3 plays which in their day were considered wildly subversive. You remember the scene in the film Amadeus when the emperor tells Mozart that The Marriage of Figaro is a wicked play. Even my own dear sister, Marie Antoinette, tells me she is becoming afraid of her own people. Beaumarchais' 3 plays are The Barber of Seville, The Marriage of Figaro, and The Guilty Mother. All have been set to music, though confusingly not in the correct order. Mozart's brilliant Marriage of Figaro dates from 1786, Rossini's Barber, as we have seen, from 30 years later, 1816. And much later still, Francis Poulenc wrote A Mère Coupable, The Guilty Mother, which is the least remembered of the 3. So although Rossini wrote his opera second, it is really a prequel to Mozart's, just like Star Wars. Well, not exactly like Star Wars. The other great source and influence, in addition to the Beaumarchais play, is Commedia dell'arte, that magical itinerant Italian tradition with its stock characters of the lovely Columbine, the poor but resourceful Harlequin, and the doddering old Pantalone. Archetypes whom you see recreated in our heroine Rosina, in Figaro, and in Dr. Bartolo. Commedia dell'arte companies had a number of stock plots, and the actor-manager would simply announce to the cast the outline of that night's episode, and the actors would make up dialogue as they went along. For a brilliant recreation of Commedia dell'arte in action, you might rent or buy a video of Leoncavallo's I Pagliacci to see how it was done. Rossini's opera is, of course, fully written out, but that air of make-do, of innovation, of narrow escapes from authority prevails, and motivates much of the action. L'arte di arrangiarsi, the Italians call it, the art of getting by. Let's start, shall we, with the overture. It's another delightful paradox that generations of opera-goers have had their appetites whetted for the comic delights to follow by this glorious overture, which seems so perfectly to set the scene and the mood for the delicious nonsense to follow. So it comes as a shock to learn that Rossini, finding himself chronically short of time at the last moment, as usual, simply lifted the overture from a previous and deeply tragic opera, Elisabetta, Regina d'Inghilterra, and pasted it onto the front of his most light-hearted comedy. Self-plagiarism was always a characteristic of Rossini, and we'll return to that thought later. The overture opens with 2 loud chords, which are the musical equivalent, literally, of the man who used to thump his staff on the stage to say, "Be quiet and pay attention, we're about to begin." After a long, slow introduction, we encounter that tune we heard at the beginning, an allegro con brio, that is full of that energy and, to switch languages, joie de vivre, which are Rossini's outstanding qualities. But he can also be as lyrical and tender as the next one. If we can stand another paradox, we should learn that the musical invention for which Rossini is best remembered is the Rossini crescendo, and it wasn't invented by Rossini. It is a device for turning the screw of excitement by making the music louder and louder from a quiet opening to a very noisy climax. It was invented by an honest workmanlike composer called Giovanni Simone Maia. But Rossini made it famous, made it a trademark almost. We encounter one in the overture, and we'll meet several more in the course of the opera. The opera opens on a street in Seville, just before dawn, and the first voice we hear is the servant Fiorello urging his band of musicians to keep the volume down, lest they wake the occupants of Dr. Bartolo's house, outside which they are to meet their employer, the Count Almaviva. Here's Fiorello urging softly, softly, piano pianissimo, and the chorus's compliance.
Senza parlar, tutti con me. Venite qua, venite qua. Piano, pianissimo, venite qua.
Next, we meet the boss, Count Almaviva. Aristocratic, young, ardent, not too bright, in love with Rosina, but determined to disguise his wealth and position by wooing her in the garb of a young student. He adopts the name Lindoro for this purpose. After some rather wheezy tuning up by the on-stage band and a comically overlong introduction, Almaviva, our tenor hero, sings his lovely serenade to the rising sun and, like Romeo, by inference, to his young love. It's a beautiful tune, graceful and elegant, and conveys all Almaviva's ardency and, yes, grace. The musicians are noisily dismissed, and we hear from off-stage maybe the most famous introduction given to any singer in the whole of opera. This is, of course, for Figaro, the barber of the title, who, in what is known as an entrance aria, tells us that he is the factotum, literally do-all of the city, Mr. Fix-It.
Larga fatotum della città largo. La 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 la. Resto bottega che l'alveggia presto. La 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 la. Ah, che bel vivere, che bel piacere, che bel piacere.
Everyone calls for me, he says, to deliver letters and to arrange assignations.
Tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono, donne e ragazzi, vecchie fanciulle, quella parrucca, presto la barba, quella sanguigna, presto il biglietto, tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono, tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono, quella parrucca, presto la barba, presto il biglietto, ehi, Figaro, 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 Figaro. Ahimè, ahimè, che furia, ahimè, che folla, uno alla volta, per carità, per carità, per carità, uno alla volta, uno
Intoxicated by his own verbosity, he rattles off some of the most demanding and tongue-twisting patter, to give it its theatrical term, given to any singer. No wonder the role, for its comic opportunities and its marvellously engaging melodies, is such a favourite with singers.
Ah, bravo Figaro, bravo bravissimo, ah, bravo Figaro, bravo bravissimo, a te fortuna, a te fortuna, a te fortuna non mancherà. La 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 la. A te fortuna, a te fortuna, a te fortuna non mancherà. Sono il patrono della città, sono il patrono della città, della città, della città, della città.
Figaro recognizes Almaviva under his student disguise and learns that he wants to meet Rosina. She is the ward, soon to be bride, of the lugubrious old Dr. Bartolo, and there is an incident which tells us that Rosina is kept under lock and key by her guardian. She does, however, manage to drop a note from her balcony, from which we learn, not surprisingly, that she has reciprocated Lindoro's love. Almaviva, Lindoro, wants to get into the house, and Figaro arranges to fix it in exchange for money. In this opera, as in so many others, love motivates the upper classes, money motivates the rest of us. So the offer of gold sets Figaro's creative juices flowing. At the idea of all that gold, a volcano of brilliant ideas erupts in my head. No shrinking violet, Figaro.
All'idea di quel metallo portentoso, onnipossente, un vulcano, la mia mente già comincia a diventarsi. All'idea di quel metallo, un vulcano, la mia mente incomincia a diventarsi, sì. All'idea di quel metallo, un vulcano, la mia mente incomincia a diventare, un vulcano incomincia a diventare.
What invention, sings the admiring Almaviva, and he and Figaro give us an infectiously joyous celebration of male genius.
Invenzione prelibata, che invenzione prelibata, bella in verità, sì, che invenzione prelibata, bella in verità, che invenzione brava in verità, che invenzione brava in verità.
The cause of this outburst of mutual admiration is Figaro's suggestion that Almaviva billet himself on Dr. Bartolo in the disguise of a soldier, and better still, a drunken soldier, and in that way can get to meet Rosina.
Invenzione prelibata, che invenzione prelibata, bella in verità, sì, che invenzione prelibata, brava in verità, che invenzione brava in verità, che invenzione brava in verità.
What invention indeed. Before they part, Almaviva and Figaro make arrangements to meet, and Figaro gives his new boss directions to the shop in a duet which is both enchanting and instructive. Almaviva is a type of tenor known in Italy as a tenore di grazia, tenor of grace. Gracious-sounding tenor hardly conveys the meaning. He sings in high, ardent tones of his love and how it burns within him, while Figaro, the lower-voiced baritone, magically underpins these flights of fancy with more pedantic sentiments about how nice it will be to make all that money.
Numero 15, a mano manca, 4 gradini, facciata bianca, 5 parrucche, nella vetrina, sopra un cartello, pomata fina, mostra in azzurro, alla moderna, vede l'insegna, una lanterna, ma senza fallo, ti troverà 5 parrucche nella vetrina, sopra un cartello, pomata fina, mostra in azzurro, alla moderna, vede l'insegna, una lanterna, la senza fallo, la senza fallo mi troverà.
Ho capito.
5 parrucche, una lanterna, la senza fallo mi troverà.
Ho ben capito.
Or vada presto,
Tu guarda bene,
io penso al resto.
di te mi fido,
Ora l'attendo,
mio caro Figaro.
intendo.
Porterò meco,
La borsa piena,
sì quel che vuoi, ma il resto poi.
non si dubiti che me ne andrò, che me ne andrò.
A che d'amore la fiamma io sento, che musica di giù e di consento. D'ardore insolito quest'alma accende, e di me stesso maggior mi fa.
Delle monete, il suo già sento.
Ma che d'amore,
Già viene l'oro, già viene l'argento,
la fiamma io
già viene l'oro, già viene l'oro.
non si
Eccolo, già viene l'argento, già viene l'argento. Eccolo, già si ascende, eccolo qua.
Eccolo,
D'ardore insolito, questa
mi
scende.
D'ardore insolito,
E di me stesso,
questa
già viene l'oro, già viene l'oro, già viene l'argento,
di me
di me
stesso mi fa.
già viene l'oro, già viene l'oro,
E di me stesso maggior mi fa.
Well, with that celebration of the twin motivators of the opera, love and money, we end the first scene of the opera. We meet now our heroine, and she is another archetype. Rosina is that theatrical favourite, the sweet young thing who looks as innocent as the day is long, but who is really a tough lady who knows how to get her way. Rosina leaves us in no doubt about this because she has an opening aria, Una voce poca fa, in which she is devastatingly frank about both her evident charms and her real nature. Again, we have a long introduction from the orchestra, but so graceful and such a clever portrait of the multi-layered Rosina that it is worth hearing it in full. Then she tells us how she has heard the voice of this young student serenading her and has determined that Lindoro mio sarà. Lindoro will be mine. I swear it. Lo giurai. And you'd better believe it.
Una voce poco fa, qui nel cor mi risuonò. Il mio cor ferito è già, ed intorno fu che il piagò. Sì, d'intorno mio sarà, lo giurai, la vincerò. Sì, d'intorno mio sarà, lo giurai, la vincerò.
It's no wonder the role of Rosina, like that of Figaro, has been such a great favourite of singers. She is given marvellous opportunities for playing the diva. After a lyrical passage for the orchestra, marked moderato, though moderation is the furthest thing from Rosina's mind, she launches into the second section of her aria. Io sono docile, she lies. I am docile, respectful and obedient. But, and listen for the little pause Rossini wittily gives us before the Italian word ma, but. Ma se mi toccano. If I don't get my way, I can be a viper. And these two ideas, her apparent docility and her real toughness, provide the material for the rest of an aria which is both a showcase for the singer-musician and a marvellous opportunity for the singer-actress to establish character. Dr. Bartolo, Rosina's guardian, has his suspicions that Rosina and the barber are plotting. So when Don Basilio enters, we can expect some serious counterplotting from the senior set. Basilio is an interesting character. He is a priest, that's why he's called Don, and he is a music teacher. Teachers are always figures of fun in this period, as they are in Shakespeare and earlier. He is also a schemer and a general lowlife. Dr. Bartolo tells him that as a precaution, he has decided to marry his ward Rosina the next day, and Basilio confirms the old man's suspicions by saying he thinks Almaviva is in town. He then proposes a scheme to discredit our tenor hero, slander, la calunnia in Italian, calumny in English. Start some gossip, some slander, suggests Basilio, and watch it develop from a breath into a breeze, into a wind, and eventually into a gale that will blow away your opponent. Let's hear the opening statement of what's known as the slander aria before we make an important point about it.
E un venticello, un'auretta assai gentile, che insensibile e sottile, leggermente e dolcemente, ma che incomincia sussurrar.
The point is that while Rossini is often castigated as a trickster who uses devices, like the Rossini crescendo simply for cheap effect, here is a case where he uses it for real dramatic and comic purpose. As Basilio describes the escalating effects of the scandal, Rossini sets it to a splendid vocal and orchestral crescendo so that the developing mood of the music perfectly matches the developing situation. Until, come un colpo di cannone, like the blast from a cannon, the victim is annihilated. This is brilliantly comic music in the service of the drama.
Dalla bocca fuori uscendo, lo schiamazzo va crescendo, prende forza poco a poco, Vola già di locco in locco, sembra il coro, lotto in testa, bene in sento, il lampo, resto, fatti schiando, brontolando, e ti quando l'orgelando, con la pintra bocca scoppia, si propaga, si raddoppia, e produce l'esplosione. Come un colpo di cannone, come un colpo di cannone, un tremoto temporale, un tremoto temporale, un tumulto generale che fa l'aria rimbombante, un tremoto temporale, un tremoto temporale, un tumulto generale che fa l'aria rimbombare.
Well, after those two old villains have finished their plotting, it's the turn of those two virtuoso schemers, Rosina and Figaro. The barber tells the lady that young Lindoro has fallen in love, and Rosina coyly asks, with whom? Figaro literally spells out the name, and in a deliciously ingenuous moment, Rosina says, Dunque io son? Then 'tis I? A lovely comic moment for a singing actress. It has the same disarming quality as Miss Piggy's pretentious moi.
R-O-Ro, e sei sì, Rosi, e ne hanno...
Rosina! Dunque io son, tu non m'inganni. Dunque io son, la fortunata. Già me l'ero immaginata, lo sapevo mia dite, dunque io son, tu non m'inganni. Già me l'ero immaginata, lo sapevo mia dite, già lo sapevo mia dite, lo sapevo mia dite.
Yes, it's you, says Figaro somewhat superfluously, and adds an aside of the surprise, surprise variety, admitting that Rosina is at least his equal in deceit, especially when he asks her to write a letter to Lindoro, and she produces it ready written. This duet is rather like the one between Figaro and Almaviva in the first scene, because when Rosina goes off in a flight of romantic fantasy, the more earthy Figaro underpins it with reflections on the complexities of women.
Donne, donne, eterni doi. Donne, donne, eterni doi. Qui verrà, a momenti per parlarvi qui sarà. Zitto, zitto, qui verrà. Donne, donne, eterni doi. Donne, donne, eterni doi.
Here is another highly entertaining confrontation. Much of this opera is made up of two character scenes, yet it is a tribute to Rossini's creativity that they are all so dissimilar, and each is enchanting in its own way. Bartolo tries to bully Rosina into compliance and tells her that, a un dottor della mia sorte, to a lawyer of my caliber, your plotting and excuses are pathetic. The wide vocal leaps add to the air of bluster which characterizes this type of singer. In Italian, a buffo. The same root as our buffoon, but it means comic rather than stupid. Here is Dr. Bartolo in full flight.
Quanto forte la mia sorte, queste scuse, signorina. Quando forte la mia sorte, queste scuse, signorina. Vi consiglio, mia carina, un po' meglio imposturar. Meglio, 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 meglio. Vi consiglio, mia carina, un po' meglio imposturar. Meglio, 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 meglio.
And to show that he can move the voice, as singers say, Dr. Bartolo has some bullying patter of his own as he attempts to browbeat our heroine.
Signorino, un'altra volta quando parlano fuori, signorino, un'altra volta quando parlano fuori, la consegna se Vittoria sua non si saprà. Signorino, un'altra volta quando parlano fuori, signorino, un'altra volta quando parlano fuori, la consegna se Vittoria sua non si saprà. E non serve di morta, sta pure la morta, faccia pure la catamorta. Questo topo quella porta, quella porta, ne mellare, poi torrà. Rossini innocentina, sconsolata, disperata, e non serve le smorfie, faccia pure la catamorta. Questo topo quella porta, ne mellare, poi torrà. E Rossini innocentina, sconsolata, disperata, mica guaglia,
This brings us to the Act 1 finale, as finely constructed and as varied as you could wish. You will remember the plan for Almaviva to intrude on Bartolo disguised as a drunken soldier. Well, here he comes, and the orchestra's lurching and staggering leaves us in no doubt as to his condition. "E di casa? Anyone home?" One of the big political issues of the time was the right not to have soldiers billeted on you, eating you out of house and casa in times of peace. So when Almaviva says he's come to stay, Bartolo protests that he has a certificate of exemption. And while he searches for it, Almaviva searches for Rosina. Basilio and the housekeeper Berta enter and add their comments. And this comic situation builds up into a chaotic but exhilarating kind of mini-finale, a finale within a finale, which is another Rossini trademark.
Che vedo?
Il barbiere.
Ho preso a bagno, bella vista.
Quanta gente.
Son di stucco. Bravo, bravo, il mamallucco. Son bravo, mamallucco. Bene, sacco, entrato e già. Son bravo, mamallucco. Bravo, bravo, il Rosina, poverina. Dico tu, cosa l'hai fatto? Ma fermate, niente ho fatto. A canaglia, traditore. Non ho fermato il signore. Io ti voglio subissar, io ti voglio subissar. Aiuto, lasciatemi, lasciatemi. Aiuto, per pietà.
Figaro rushes in and tries to calm everyone down, in itself an example of comic irony, since all the mayhem is of his planning.
Che cosa accade? Signori miei, che chiasso è questo? E fermi lei, già sulla strada, a questo stento, s'è radunata mezza città. Già sulla strada, a questo stento, s'è radunata mezza città. Signor giudizio, per carità. Questo è birrante,
Questo un briccone,
a disgraziato.
a maledetto!
Signor soldato, porti rispetto, signor soldato, porti rispetto. Questo fusto, corpo del diavolo, la creanza gli insegnerà. Signor giudizio, per carità.
But it's too late. Someone hearing all the noise has called the cops, and they arrive. La forza. And with a mock solemnity worthy of the most serious Italian grand and tragic opera, the cast comment on this awesome development.
La forza, o diavolo, l'avete fatta, l'avete fatta, venga purqua, questa avventura.
They all try to put their case to the commanding officer, all at the same time, naturally enough. And he makes a Solomonic judgment that Almaviva must be arrested and taken to jail. In a class-conscious comment of the sort that made this opera seem almost subversive in its day, Almaviva offers proof of his aristocratic credentials. The officer tugs his forelock, and Almaviva gets saluted instead of incarcerated. Everyone is dumbstruck. And fortunately, dumbstruck is something Rossini does very well. We have a wonderful ensemble, freddo ed immobile, cold and immobile, in which each character expresses his degree of dumbstruckness in music of a marvellous comic, serious nature. Figaro, the iconoclast, Figaro the factotum and everyman, chips in with, "Look at Don Bartolo. Guarda Don Bartolo. He's as rigid as a statue."
Guarda Don Bartolo, guarda Don Bartolo, sembra una statua, sembra una statua, fiamma da ridere, sta destra e stirare.
Bartolo breaks the spell by an expression of injured outrage. This encourages the rest of the cast and the chorus of police to launch into an exhilarating ensemble, called a stretta, meaning stretched, presumably because that's what the singers are, to sing it in rhythm and with the comic versatility and sheer musicality necessary to make a success of this fiendishly difficult music. It's very long, so here is just a short extract from Naxos's fortunately complete and uncut recording to conclude the first act of Rossini's The Barber of Seville.
in una brigida fucina, dove perché se ne maglia la mia modesta e di tu, di sonore, di porto, una servita. Alternando questo e quello, pesantissimo martello, alternando questo e quello, pesantissimo alternando questo e quello, pesantissimo martello, alternando questo e quello, pesantissimo, questo e quello, fatto barbaronia, fatto barbaronia, alternando questo e quello, pesantissimo martello, fatto barbaronia, e c'è la dice bello, poverello, giusto dito, sbalordito, non ragiona, si compone, si riduce in dice bello, poverello, giusto dito, sbalordito, non ragiona, si compone, si riduce in
The second act opens with Bartolo ruminating on the events of the Act 1 finale and concluding that the drunken soldier must be a spy of this Count Almaviva fellow. There is a knock on the door, and our hero, the very Count Almaviva himself, enters. He is like one of those characters in the Saturday morning cartoons, a master of disguise. He now appears dressed as a weedy young priest/music teacher, allegedly sent to deputize for the allegedly ailing Dom Basilio. His wimp-like nature, a neat piece of anti-clericalism on Rossini's part, which recalls Voltaire's description of the clergy as the third sex, is characterized by a bleating tune and a bleating tone of voice as he sings, to Bartolo's growing irritation, Pace gioia, peace and joy, his ironic blessing on the house of Bartolo.
Pace, gioia sia con voi.
Mille grazie, non si incomodi.
Gioia e pace per 1000 anni.
Obbligato, in verità.
Pace e gioia sia con voi.
Mille grazie, non si incomodi.
Gioia e pace per 1000 anni.
Obbligato, in verità. Questo volto non è ignoto.
Ah, su un colpo andato vuoto.
Non ravviso, non ricordo.
Aggappar questo valor.
Ma quel volto, ma quel volto.
Dove il travestimento?
Non capisco chi sarà.
Più propizio a me sarà. Sì, sì, propizio a me sarà. Gioia e pace, pace e gioia.
Ho capito. Uccioli che noia.
In a plot twist within a plot twist, Almaviva, in disguise, gives Bartolo the letter Rosina had given him. In that way, he wins Bartolo's confidence, enough to be allowed to give Rosina a music lesson. The opera is full of these twists and turns which are more easily followed in the theatre than in a plot outline. In any event, Almaviva, who at the moment is calling himself Don Alonso, accompanies Rosina in her singing lesson. She chooses an aria from an opera called The Useless Precaution, a phrase she uses to annoy her guardian, and it's one that will come back to haunt Dr. Bartolo. Actually, the aria Contro un cor is just an excuse for some vocal fireworks from Rossini, and sopranos in the bad old days used to substitute here an aria of their own choice. The great Dame Nellie Melba could make strong men weep at this point with her rendition of Home Sweet Home. But here we will just play a short extract from the correct aria. Rossini entertainingly has Bartolo say what old men always say on these occasions, that of course there are no good singers nowadays and no good songs either. And when he was a young man, there were real singers and great songs, like this one. And he sings a serenade to Rosina in what we can still tell is a much more dated style of music than the one Rosina has just sung. In our recording, he adopts a falsetto, perhaps to suggest a castrato, who were the idols of opera in the previous century. Here is just a phrase or two of Bartolo's antique aria. Figaro arrives to shave Bartolo, and is interrupted when the supposedly indisposed Don Basilio makes a surprise entrance. Figaro, who earlier claimed medical skills to match his barbering ability, quickly diagnoses scarlet fever, scarlatina, and with the added inducement of a cash bribe from Almaviva, Basilio is persuaded to retire off the scene and to bed.
Bagatella, coste tu, e tremarella, bagatella, bagatella, tremarella, tremarella. Questa è sempre scarlattina, scarlattina.
Via prendete medicina. Via prendete medicina, non vi state a rovinar.
Presto, presto, andate a letto.
Poi paura inventate.
Che cervelli attacca nel cuore.
Presto, andate a riposare.
Presto andate a riposare.
Una borsa, andate a letto. Ma che tutti siano d'accordo. Presto a letto, 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 presto a letto.
To get him to leave, first Almaviva, then each of the rest of the assembled company repeatedly bids Basilio to take his leave in the valedictory phrase, buonasera, good evening, goodbye. When Basilio gets hold of the phrase, it is every bit as deliberately irritating as Don Alonso's pace gioia. Here are a few of its many repetitions.
Buonasera, mio signore. Buonasera, mio signore, presto andate via di qua.
Buonasera, mio signore.
Buonasera, buonasera.
Buonasera, mio signore. Presto andate via di qua.
Buonasera, mio signore. signore.
Buonasera, buonasera.
Buonasera, mio signore. Presto andate via di qua.
The next thing that happens is that while Figaro attempts to distract Bartolo by shaving him, Rosina and our hero make plans to elope that evening. But Bartolo overhears and drives the men from the house in another of these exhilarating and musically fiendish ensembles, another mini-finale, which are among the greatest joys of Rossini's operas.
Picconi, picconi, il batti, bricconi, a voi tutti quanti, non avete giurato di farli crepar, su buoni furbanti, di voi accoppar. La testa vi gira, ma zitto dottore, la testa vi gira, ma zitto dottore, il batti, su buoni furbanti di voi accoppar. Da gente, non serve gridare, avete giurato di farli crepar, ma zitto dottore, mi fate burlare, da gente, non serve gridare, per gente, non serve gridare. L'amico dell'ira, di questi ci siamo, di questi ci siamo, l'amico dell'ira, di questi ci siamo, non deve piccare, di questi ci siamo, non deve piccare, non deve piccare. La testa vi gira, ma zitto dottore, la testa vi gira, ma zitto dottore, mi fate burlarti, su buoni furbanti di voi accoppare. La gente, non serve gridare, avete giurato di farli crepare, ma zitto dottore, mi fate burlare, la gente, non serve gridare, per gente, non serve gridare. L'amico dell'ira, in questi ci siamo, l'amico dell'ira, in questi ci siamo, non deve piccare, in questi ci siamo, non deve piccare, non deve piccare. La gente, parliamo, la gente, non deve gridare, mi fate burlare, ci siamo, in questi ci siamo, non deve piccare. La gente, parliamo, la gente, non deve gridare, mi fate burlare, in questi ci siamo, non deve piccare, non serve gridare, non serve gridare.
It must be apparent by now that one outstanding quality of Rossini's theatrical genius is the ability to alternate periods of calm, though not many of them, with periods of intense excitement. So, in a moment of comparative calm, we have the housekeeper, Berta, also known as Marcellina, telling us how she is getting on in age and will probably never find a husband. Her attempts to do so will, of course, be one of the many subplots of The Marriage of Figaro. Here is just a taste of the aria. I say taste because these Act 2 arias, usually given to a singer to assuage their vanity, contribute nothing to the plot and were known as arie di sorbetto, ice cream arias, because the Italians would go out during them to get an ice cream. Here, then, is a lick of Berta's aria.
Cerca moglie, vuol marito la ragazza, quello frega e questa pazza, tutti e due son da legar. Date a due son da legar. Date a due son da legar. Tutti e due son da legar. Tutti e due son da legar. Tutti e due son da legar.
Bartolo has shown the letter to Rosina. That's the letter she gave to Lindoro, also known as Almaviva, and which Almaviva, also known as Don Alonso, gave to Dr. Bartolo. All clear so far? Dr. Bartolo uses the letter to convince Rosina that Lindoro is double-dealing her with Almaviva. So Rosina tells her guardian of the plot to elope that evening. When Figaro and Almaviva turn up that night, actually climb up a ladder to Rosina's balcony, Rosina confronts Lindoro with his alleged unfaithfulness. In a marvellously comic moment, Lindoro reveals that he is in fact Almaviva. Again, we have that very funny effect when Rosina, who has won the equivalent of the national lottery in matrimonial terms, expresses her surprise and delight. Figaro has his cynical asides. Almaviva echoes his lover's delight. We'll start with the tenor's Almaviva son io, non son Lindoro. I'm Almaviva, not Lindoro.
Almaviva son io, non son Lindoro.
Colpo inaspettato, egli stesso, o ciel, che sento di sorpresa e di
rimasti senza fiato, ora muoio dal contento. Guarda, guarda il mio talento, che bel colpo seppe far.
Qual trionfo inaspettato, me felice, oh bel momento.
Figaro cuts short the romanticising and suggests they all get on with the elopement. And we have an exhilarating little trio, zitti zitti, quickly, quickly, as we plan our escape.
Zitti piano piano, non facciamo confusione, per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua.
Zitti piano piano, non facciamo confusione, per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua.
Zitti piano piano, non facciamo confusione, per la scala del balcone,
Presto andiamo via di qua.
per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua.
Piano, per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua. Zitti piano piano, non facciamo confusione, per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua.
Per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua.
Piano, piano, per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua. Zitti, zitti, piano, piano, zitti, zitti, piano, piano, per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua. Zitti, zitti, piano, piano, zitti, zitti, piano, piano, per la scala del balcone, presto andiamo via di qua. Presto andiamo via di qua, via di qua, via di qua, via di qua, via di qua.
Things move swiftly to their conclusion. The elopers find that Dr. Bartolo has removed the ladder to prevent Rosina's escape. When Basilio arrives with a notary to perform the wedding of Rosina to Dr. Bartolo, he is offered by Almaviva the choice of a diamond ring or a bullet through the head. He takes the ring. Bartolo blusters in with an arresting officer, but it is too late. The device of removing the ladder, the useless precaution, has proved fatal to the doctor's plans, as it has provided the means for Almaviva to wed his Rosina. At this point, most productions and many recordings move to the finale. But the Naxos recording and most festival productions nowadays treat us to a marvellous aria which has as interesting a provenance as the recycled overture we discussed earlier. Almaviva advises Bartolo to resist no longer. Cessa di più resistere, he sings in an aria usually cut in performance. Let's hear that phrase.
Cessa di più resistere, non cimentar mio sdegno.
The aria is often omitted because it comes very late in the evening and it holds up the denouement. And besides, both the tenor and the audience are pretty tired by this time. But it ends with a lovely rondo, or round, for which we shall coin the phrase advance self-plagiarism. When Rossini came to write his Cinderella, La Cenerentola, the following year, and found himself presumably up against a deadline, he lifted this tenor aria and rearranged it as the final showstopper of Cinderella. So while you probably know it as a mezzo-soprano aria, here is a rare chance to hear it in its original form as a tenor aria, and in its original place, in the finale to the Barber of Seville.
Al più lieto, più felice, e mio cor deco via man, di non fuggite, o lieti stanti della mia felicità. Non fuggite, non fuggite, al più lieto, più felice, e mio cor deco via man, non fuggite, o lieti stanti della mia felicità. Non fuggite, non fuggite, al più lieto, più felice, il mio cor decori amanti, non fuggite, o lieti santi della mia felicità. Non fuggite, o lieti stanti della mia felicità. Non fuggite, o lieti stanti della mia felicità. Quando dorme con gli amanti e piacer fallo da, non fuggite, o lieti stanti della mia felicità. Non fuggite, o lieti stanti della mia felicità. Lieti stanti della mia felicità.
Compared with the lunatic frenzy of the Act 1 finale, that for Act 2 is a lovelier, more resigned piece of work. The lovers are happily united, the commercial classes, Figaro and Basilio, have been paid off, and Dr. Bartolo has learned, like so many opera buffos before and since, that there is no fool like an old fool. Here then are the closing pages of Rossini's magical score to one of the most enjoyable operas in the whole repertoire, The Barber of Seville.